Hello and welcome to Sunday Night Conversations presented by D1Baseball.com. I am your host, Michael Patrick Rooney. Tonight's episode brought to us by our good friends at Netting Pros, the official netting partner of D1 Baseball and Sunday Night Conversations. They're the industry leaders in sports facility netting and equipment solutions. You'll find their products at some of the top venues in Division I college baseball. Talking about our defending national champs, University of Tennessee, University of Texas, Arkansas, Texas A&M, Oregon State, LSU, Mississippi State, and so many more. Whether it's batting practice equipment, facility netting, custom wall padding, or custom facility improvements, Netting Professionals is the top choice in the industry for facility equipment solutions. Visit nettingpros.com to learn more. We are so grateful to the guys at Netting Pros. They are absolutely awesome. So Sunday Night Conversations, we have an awesome topic tonight. We are going to talk about Tennessee baseball, the defending national champs, and we're talking about the road to winning a national title in baseball because I'll give you guys my premise. By the way, my two guests are Ben McKee of GoVols247 and Chris Burke. And if you're listening to this show, you absolutely know who Chris from Louisville is, the 2001 SEC Player of the Year. And guys, here's my premise. Here's why I wanted to do this with you two. If you think about this stat blows me away. Tennessee in baseball has made the NCAA tournament just 14 times. 14. That's it in the history of the program. The 1951 team was the national runner-up. And then the next tournament team, NCAA tournament team, was Todd Helton's freshman year in 1993. That's 4 decades without going to regionals. And so, I don't have great familiarity with that time period for Tennessee baseball, but, there was a complete lack of relevance there. And if you think about the team that just won the national title, so Tennessee's been to 14 regionals. Texas, for context, has been to the College World Series 38 times. So think about that ridiculousness right there.
Yeah.
But all that
Florida
said,
State went like 45 straight years.
That's right. Well said. So, but think about this. We are halfway through a decade, and there is no doubt that Tennessee is the program of this current decade that we're in. I think that's indisputable. You think about the 2021 team that kind of got Tony V and this program back to Omaha. That team, it's easy to forget, was the number 3 national seed that year. Mm-hmm. Like they didn't just like sneak into Omaha. And then, the 22 team was so famous, and the 23 team, you could almost argue equally famous in a completely different way. And then obviously last year's team wins it all. So let's do this, guys. I want to have you guys introduce yourself real quick, just with a question I'm going to ask you, and then we'll jump into this. So Ben, tell me this. So you've been the reason we wanted you to have you on here, Ben, because to me you're as plugged in as anybody with Tennessee sports and Tennessee baseball in particular. So here's my question: how does it come to pass that Ben McKee is covering the Vols for his livelihood? How did this happen to you, or for you?
Yeah, for me. First, I'll say I appreciate you having me on. Always good to talk with you, and of course Chris Burke, who I like to joke with him, and John Wilkerson, that those two are 3 of the Tennessee baseball goats with the great Todd Helton. So good to talk to you tonight. But kind of, I guess I kind of caught lightning in a bottle. Baseball was my favorite sport growing up, and as a student at UT, I kind of started just covering Tennessee baseball when it wasn't the most popular thing to do, just because I loved being around baseball and SEC baseball. I went to high school in Huntsville, Alabama, so being close to Hoover and understanding how great the SEC tournament is, I was always kind of jealous that where I was going to school, college baseball wasn't that important at that time. And so it was more just out of a passion for baseball that I was covering it as a student journalist. And of course, when you're a student journalist, you kind of take any opportunity that comes your way. So any football, men's basketball, women's basketball, baseball, softball that you can take, I took and ran with it, and just kind of stuck with it just because I love baseball. And I like to tell people that I got a little lucky that Tony Vitello came along at the same time, and Tony Vitello is Tony Vitello and is elite at what he does, and I've just been riding his coattails, I guess you could say, for the last several years.
Well, timing is everything. I love it. No, that's awesome, and it's cool. Like I'd never thought of Hoover that way, but you could see where Hoover being such an event would create like fans for life. That's a great point. Hey,
Mm.
Berkey, I've never asked you this. Like, I know that you were recruited by Paul Maneri when he was at Notre Dame, and you said no, and I kind of like shut down your story from there. I really wasn't all that interested.
Yeah.
But I kid. But we like growing up in Louisville, was a school like Tennessee on your radar as a sports fan as a kid, or was that not? It really your Tennessee life started when they recruited you for baseball.
Yes, my Tennessee life started when they recruited me for baseball. It's funny you asked that. I'm in the car right now driving home from my parents' house eating dinner, and my dad, Roons, you'll appreciate this. I feel like my dad was misplaced at birth. He's actually from Jeffersonville, Indiana, but he's all Philly at heart because he's like
Love that.
the most negative fan ever. So like Tennessee just laid an egg last night against Arkansas, and he's literally like he's so over them. You've never seen anything like it. He's like, they're horrible. He's like, I'm kind of literally he said this to me. I can't really get into college football yet this year because Notre Dame stinks and Tennessee stinks. I'm like, Dad, like they just lost their first game, and yeah,
great.
it wasn't, but that's how he is. So I say that he's a Hoosier, so he's kind of an Indiana Notre Dame guy, but he's such a bad fan that I didn't grow up rooting for his teams because he just basically dogged them all the time. You know what I'm saying? So I was just kind of up for grabs and rooted for whoever was good, like most kids do. And so when I went into my recruitment, I truly was just kind of wide open to whatever school I fell in love with, and it came down to Tennessee and Notre Dame. And once I took my visit to Tennessee, it was a wrap.
Love that. That's awesome. Gosh, Big Al, your dad, as we
He's a
affectionately
riot.
call him.
Yes,
He's the best.
Big Al.
That's the best. Oh man. Hey, so let's do this, guys. So and Berkey, I'll probably hit you first on this. So I think about, like I've mentioned, a limited background. Like this is going to sound a little pejorative, but like Tennessee to me is not one of the privileged college baseball programs.
Right.
It feels like whenever they do something big, they have to smash in the front door. They are not invited to the party on their own. But when Rod Delmonico got the job, he had been Mike Martin's assistant for 7 years, and that's instant credibility. And then there's the Rod Delmonico marriage with Todd Helton, where like this, I when I looked this up, I had a double take. I didn't realize Tennessee won the SEC in baseball in 93, 94, and 95.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And like that's right in the center of the storm of LSU baseball. Like that's not when Skip Bertman's getting started. That's when Skip Bertman is winning national titles.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that blew me away. But obviously Todd Helton is a freshman. I also forgot this. Todd Helton was a second round pick out of high school, but wanted to play football for the Vols. You're really, if your success depends on getting second round picks to school, that's not a great formula typically. But Berkey, so like of the 14 NCAA tournament appearances, Coach Delmonico's 8 of them.
Yes.
And really built, like he really made Tennessee big time relevant in the 90s. What you played for him, Berkey, like how would you describe that era, the Coach Delmonico era of college of Tennessee baseball?
Well, let me just say from 51, like you said, from 51 to 93, there's a gap. But what's interesting is there were some great players. I mean, you're talking about Condrich Holloway, Phil Garner. Those are 2 of the 3 retired numbers at the school. And then Rick Honeycutt was during that era. Bubba Trammell. Not Bubba Trammell, even though he was a great player during Todd's era. Golly, he was the Yankees. Anyway, it'll come to me. Alan Cockrell, excuse me. Like there were some great players. Cockrell was another quarterback who played a very long time of professional baseball and was an All-American player. So, but for whatever reason, the program never caught any footing from a team standpoint. Coach Delmonico shows up and obviously has the formula. He comes from the Mike Martin tree and was just an incredibly gifted, what I would say, motivator. He could really sell. And he's probably the greatest. I would say it's fair to say he's the greatest base running / base stealing coach the league has ever seen. And like all great coaches they need some great players to show up on campus. And it was an interesting time there early for Coach D where you had Todd Helton, Chris Freeman, and Bubba Trammell had all come out of Central High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. So, he hired a great staff. He had Larry Simcox with him. Of course, he had Dave Serrano there with him early, and but it was really him and Larry that were the linchpins of that staff. And he had some great local players. And then, of course, soon after, R.A. Dickey showed and of course of all time, and then you got Coach D that could really motivate and really, I thought as a player, was one of the best guys at teaching base running / base stealing, but also people don't realize this. Coach D was all into like bunting for hits and that kind, but he loved the home run, loved it. I saw him kick people out of practice for not hitting home runs in batting practice. Seriously.
Love that.
Seriously. So like, I feel like he's known for the small game and the base stealing stuff, but like I hit 2 home runs my freshman year, 4 home runs my sophomore year, and 20 my junior year. And that's only because he pulled me off to the side after my sophomore year and said, hey man, you've hit a whole bunch of doubles your first 2 years. And if you could just get a little more load and get into your backside a little bit more as you gather and get ready to hit, I think you can hit the ball at the ballpark. Now, Roons, as you know, that's not easy to do after a guy just hit leadoff for you. And I was, I just set the school record for hits and I'm going to play for Team USA. Like most guys would just be like, hey man, just be a leadoff hitter, do what you've been doing. He was like, man, there's more in the tank. And so I just think Coach Delmonico, I don't think he gets his due. But I think when you put it in that context, that they literally went 4 decades without a regional, and he's been to more than half of the school's regionals ever. Of course, Tony will surpass that soon. But it just shows you how great his run was. And it also coincided with some of the all-time great players the school's ever had.
Yeah, no, that's great. And like Coach Delmonico's from the era of coaches where the personalities were huge, and he had that. Like obviously I got to coach against you guys, and you noticed Coach Delmonico across the field. Like he was a presence. He was and obviously an elite recruiter, all the things you just described. So Ben, I'm going to have you fast forward us into this next period. And I'm going to call it, these were dark days. I was trying to think of a more clever way to say it, but these were darker days for Tennessee baseball. And some of it does overlap with Coach Delmonico, even though he goes to Omaha in 95. He goes to Omaha in 01, Berkey's team. He goes back to Omaha in 2005 with that awesome team. But think about this. Where's my stat? Okay, from 1998 to 2019, Tennessee never finished 500 in the SEC. Not once in that period. 1998 to 2019, that's 21, maybe 23 seasons. The Vols never even hit 500 in SEC play. And so, and you're talking about some good coaches. Like Todd Raleigh is a Jack Leggett disciple. He's got you can't call Todd Raleigh a bad baseball guy. He sired a big league all-star catcher, right? Like this guy clearly knows baseball. Dave Serrano is one of the few living human beings who took 2 different programs to Omaha as a head coach. So I'm going to give you a premise, Ben, and I want you to take it wherever you want, because your coverage is kind of in the Serrano's era and Tony V. One of the things that I think hurt, by the way, like some of the assistant coaches too in those times, like Larry Simcox, Eric Thomas, Bill Mosiello. But one of the problems was, to me, for those coaches, the SEC East got nasty. Like it got awesome. Like Kentucky won an SEC. South Carolina got on a heater. Georgia was going to Omaha under Coach Purnell. And then the big problem was Florida and Vandy. But what say you, Ben, like as you look back on that time period before Tony V takes over, why was Tennessee struggling so much in baseball?
I think the biggest reason was that there just wasn't a commitment to the baseball program. That wasn't the only reason per se, but I think it was the biggest issue that the baseball program was facing. I feel like today's era of college athletics, universities are more willing to buy into multiple sports rather than one sport. And of course, we know Tennessee is a football school. That's where the bread is buttered, and they're the ones that produce the money and whatnot. And I think during that time period, it was kind of football first and foremost, and then maybe check on some other sports here and there. Of course, during that time at Tennessee, you had Pat Summitt. Basketball went through basketball was struggling in the early 2000s before Bruce Pearl got in there and rejuvenated the men's basketball fan base as well. That was about the time the Weeklies, Ralph and Karen, made it to campus. So you had some other peripheral sports that were starting to have success. But I think in regards to baseball specifically, I just don't know that the proper resources were being submitted to the program. And on top of that, with Coach Delmonico, I mean, there was a parting of ways because the university wanted him to do things differently than he wanted to do things. And it's easy to say now in hindsight, but I think it would be even easier to say at that time, whoever was assessing the program, like, why would you not trust Coach Delmonico to do what he wants to do and do it his way? Because he had obviously had a ton of success up until that point. So I don't think that the only issue was the fact that the proper resources were not being pumped into the program, but especially as you got closer to the Dave Serrano era and right before Tony got to Knoxville, I really think it became a big issue then of just nobody really caring about Tennessee baseball other than the people that were actually within the program and a couple of diehards here and there who were still left over from the Delmonico days and era. It's just it was not a priority. There wasn't support. And, it's easy for, I think, opposing fan bases to kind of chuckle at Tennessee and point fingers. I've seen this on social media during Tennessee's climb that, oh, nice of you to finally start caring about college baseball and whatnot. But how can you blame fans for not really committing their energy and their peace in their head as a fan when the university itself isn't even pumping resources into the program or support into the program? So I think they fell behind because of that, where not saying that it was the wrong decision to prioritize football. I just think that baseball was left in the dust, so to speak, as a result of Tennessee being a football school. And I think you saw some of that at other schools as well. Because you didn't necessarily have the history that an LSU has or some of those other programs inside of the SEC has. And there's more specific things that we can talk about pertaining to each of the coaches before Tony. Dave Serrano specifically, I know his era a little bit more because as I was getting older and as a teenager and getting into college. But Coach Serrano had some bad luck along the ways. I've spoken to him and he's admitted that he kind of got away from being his true self and kind of getting away from the things that made him a successful baseball coach. And he has some regrets of getting away and kind of letting the pressures of the job change who he was and how he went about doing things. So on top of some personal missteps here and there from Coach Serrano, there's also some bad luck involved as well. Berkey is well-versed in that. Mookie Betts, they think Mookie Betts is on his way to campus, and I mean, at the very last second, he elects to sign and turn pro.
So you're saying that would have helped, Ben? You're saying Mookie Betts could have helped?
I think so.
Can you imagine?
I think Mookie Betts would have played well at Lindsey Nelson. So there was some bad luck along the way as well. Lane Thomas, you saw him hit a home run in the playoffs. He's a Knoxville kid, and he was signed to Tennessee and doesn't make it because of the draft. They had several instances, and that obviously happens at every school in the country. But when Tennessee at the time isn't as established as the LSUs in the world, and you have a couple of your top dogs, and then the rest of the signing class, it's a pretty steep drop off after those couple of top guys, and they don't make it to campus, then you're in a world of hurt. So I do think there are obviously some separate issues with each coach along the way after Delmonico. But personally, Berkey, I don't know how you feel about that long stretch of downtime, but I just don't know that the program had the proper support to succeed, even if you had the right people in place.
Berkey, let me tee you up on that for a second.
Yeah.
One thing I mentioned to Ben, and Ben brought up the point of investment and in the program, and I think that it can come off as a little cliche at times. Like every coach in the free world says that their program needs more investment. However, I can see the disconnection here, like Ben's pointing out, because Coach Delmonico spoils you as a department because he's getting to Omaha over a decade period with whatever the investment was. But what the school the athletic department can't see coming is hey, by the way, the two programs that are going to be the program of the next decade, the 2010s, are actually in your division. One of them is hours away from your campus. Like, that's going to be a problem. Like, if you think spending the same check is going to, and then that doesn't even include South Carolina playing in the national championship game 3 years in a row, winning two of them. So I hadn't really thought of it that way, because it does feel a little cliche to me, but what I think the school didn't see was in that division, which was always strong, the temperature got cranked way up.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think at the end of the day, if you look at Virginia, Louisville, Vanderbilt, and now I'll say Tennessee, Roons, forgive me if I'm missing somebody recent, maybe TCU with Schloss showing up, like programs that had little to zero history, and the right dude shows up. I think what's been proven is the administration eventually gets on board.
Yeah.
And so not to discount anything Ben said, but, you know, I was at Tennessee when it was, I wouldn't say our program was in great shape when I was there, but we had a great season. It was coming off a stretch where it had been a great program. And so I knew that it could be that, but I remember when it was going through its valleys, how many people in the national media said it wasn't a good job. And, you know, I knew the fan base was so supportive of winners that if the right guy got in there and started to win, that it would immediately garner. I mean, Bruce Pearl did it in hoops, right? You just knew that if the right guy got in there, the rest of the pieces would fall into place. And that's not to say those other guys weren't the right guy, but Tony had the right formula that those other guys that I mentioned had, which is and I know we're not to Tony yet necessarily, but he just wins in player acquisition. Like he's just really good at getting really good players. But I think, again, if you go back to O'Connor and McDonald and Corbin and Schlossnagel, guys, and I'm not discounting O'Sullivan, like you said, or and really even Tanner. I guess, you know, South Carolina probably didn't have a ton of history. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
They were okay. Yeah, it was just fine.
Probably not as much as Florida. Florida probably had a little bit more. But you think of Florida as being a sleeping giant, whether they're always good or not, right? Nobody thought Virginia was a sleeping giant in baseball. I know for a fact nobody thought Louisville was a sleeping giant in baseball, right? And so I just think Coach Delmonico, and I think obviously now Tony, has proven, and then again those other guys that I've named, that like to a degree there's a lot of programs that can be great programs if the right dude can put all the pieces together.
Yep. Amen. Hey, so before we fast forward to the Tony V era, which this is going to be really fun, I want to say thanks again to Netting Pros, college baseball's top facility equipment and netting supplier. They're the official netting partner of D1 Baseball and Sunday Night Conversations. To learn more, head over to nettingpros.com. I want to say thanks to those guys. By the way, if you're a coach listening there, Netting Pros, their stuff is awesome. They love college baseball. They don't like college baseball. They love it. So you get to purchase the best stuff from people that aren't just trying to sell you something. They really care. Like if they're putting their name in your facility, it's going to be real important to them. It has been an awesome partnership. So love working with those guys.
I need to call those guys. We need new nets at Christian Academy. So
Let's
get that number from you. Yeah.
Love it. Hey, so Berkey, you teed us up perfectly. So Tony V gets hired, and I think as like a third party person that's interested in Tennessee baseball, I was a little depressed. Like, you know, Coach Raleigh struggles, and that's one thing. You know, you can talk yourself into Western Carolina to the SEC was too big. And then Coach Serrano struggles. And, you know, as Ben, you alluded to, there's all kinds of reasons. It's never one reason. But, you know, the dude did take two different programs to Omaha. I'm starting to feel like, dang, like this is getting spooky for Tennessee baseball. Because, you know, for me, like I'm thinking about Coach D and Todd Helton and your team, Berkey, and it's starting to feel like, man, maybe that was just like lightning in the bottle, like you mentioned, Ben. So Tony V gets hired. And to your point, Berkey, like when Corbs was an assistant at Clemson, when he's going to be a head coach, you're like, obviously, right? Like this is like a head coach who is, and like he is a head coach. When Dan McDonald's the assistant coach at Ole Miss and he gets hired by Louisville, you're like, obviously. Schloss, the same thing. Now, Brian O'Connor, the same thing. When he, it's like, yeah, Notre Dame's got 2 head coaches. Now Oak goes to Virginia. I will say Sully, when he was at Clemson, you didn't have that same feeling because the shadow of Corbs was a little big. And that now, of course, that was, Sully's been incredible there. And I felt like I would put Tony V in the Sully section, not the Corbs section. Like when Tony V came up as the candidate Tennessee was going to hire, I'm thinking, okay, dude's an awesome recruiter. Like he's not a good recruiter. He's an awesome recruiter. He's been at awesome programs. Wherever he's been, they've won at a high level. Like the Mizzou time, ridiculous. Mizzou went to 7 straight regionals in that era. Like that was, that was amazing. But I did think to myself, okay, at least I know they're going to get better players. Like that, and that is a good start. But Ben, let's start with you. When Tony V is hired, what was like your first reaction?
Exactly what you just described, that I know that he's going to bring in great players, which is what Tennessee obviously needed. Tennessee just lacked so much talent. I mean, go look at – it was kind of a running joke amongst some of the media members this year and some people in the press box at Tennessee home games that just go look at the power numbers from the year before Tony got there compared to this past season, and just it's remarkable how big of a difference and how far Tennessee has come since before Tony got here. And it's all a result of bringing in elite talent. And that's something that he did right away. So I was curious because nobody had heard really of Tony Vitello. And it's this assistant coach at Arkansas. And Arkansas has had a great deal of success with Coach Van Horn. And you think, okay, well, if there's a program that you're going to hire away from, Arkansas right now in the sport is one of the programs that you would like to steal one of their coaches away from. So a little concern, I guess, with it being a first-time head coaching job, just because you never know how somebody is going to react and handle the pressure of being the head coach for the first time. So that was a little bit of a question mark and a concern. But Tennessee baseball, I also felt like it was kind of in a position to where it had to go that route because I agree kind of with what Berkey was getting at. And I don't know if Berkey's willing to go this far, but I kind of feel like Tennessee baseball was a sleeping giant because of where it's located, the passion for baseball in the South, the passion of Tennessee fans and just willing to support a winner, as Berkey said, as long as it has Tennessee across the chest. You can see now in hindsight that if you got the right person in here with a little bit of edge to them, that could connect people the way that Tony has been able to bring people together, then it could really take off. And that's been the case. But although that there may have been some pieces in place that a coach could take and run, it maybe wasn't as attractive of a situation because of the last 15 years or so, they had not done anything. And the facilities were so far behind. You all just got done detailing Tennessee's opponents that they have to play every year. You're already country miles behind them. The facilities are country miles behind. It was a steep uphill climb. And so it was kind of that perfect marriage of Tony receiving his first head coaching opportunity at a big-time institution, but Tennessee being in a little bit of a position to where they had to take a shot on somebody. And John Curry is a hot topic amongst Tennessee fans, but one of the great things he did was hire Tony Vitello. He hit the nail on the head with that hire. His youthful energy was exactly what the baseball program needed at the time.
Love that. Berkey, what say you? What was your gut reaction when Tony V got hired?
Well, I was kind of in the process of that myself.
That's so right.
It was a personal deal for me to a degree, even though I knew I was always on the periphery of the whole thing. So it wasn't like I was, expecting to get the job by any means. But it was a little bit caught me off guard. But as soon as I heard the name, I did know the pedigree. Obviously, I'd known Tony from being on the road and calling so many Arkansas games. And I also knew Tony through Kirk Sarlos at TCU, who Kirk and I were Astro teammates and longtime buddies. So here's what I liked about it once I zoomed out and really observed it initially was, the first thing you got to do to have a chance in the SEC is compete on the recruiting trail. Like you have to be committed to the recruiting trail at a level that I don't know how many people that haven't been in it can relate to. So you knew he checked that box. And then he hired Frank Anderson. And I thought, well, that's a really good hire. That's a very mature, big picture hire. And you also know Frank Anderson's not going to hitch his wagons to somebody that he doesn't believe in. So I thought early on, this is interesting. And I remember calling one of their games in 2018. And, I think we all would agree the margins between Dave Serrano going to 3 regionals and Dave Serrano missing the SEC tournament, we know this is true every year. It's 2 or 3 plays in 3 or 4 games. I mean, that's just how close the bad teams are from the good teams. And in 2018, Tony's first group, I think they went like 27 and 26 or something like that. And you could just see how sick he was about it. Like, oh, this dude like really, really hates losing, And I remember one of the first players he ever got right when he got the job was Garrett Crochet. And you're like, how the heck did you get Garrett Crochet? Like, what? You know what I mean? Like, you got Garrett Crochet. And then, 2019, they're in a regional final. And you talk to him and he's like, oh gosh, like there's no sense of, hey, isn't that really good what we did in year 2? We got to a regional final. It was like sick that they didn't win the regional.
Yep.
And then he come back in 2020 and, he likes to tell people he feels like that was one of the, but Roons, you and I do this around the country. Everybody was going to win the national championship in 2020. Literally,
there's a lot of trophies in 2020.
There's like 15 national championship trophies.
Omaha was crowded that year.
Yes. But they were 15-2 or whatever they were, and they did have
swept that Round Rock Classic. They beat Tech, Stanford, and Houston all in the same weekend, and you're like, whoa. Now they did lose that last weekend too. Remember they lost the home series to Wright State.
Yeah.
And we're going to come back to Wright State,
who's no slouch. But they had Crochet, who was just getting healthy, I believe, and they had the Texas JUCO kid whose name escapes me right now.
Chad
but the other one that ended up not pitching. There you go. Yeah. And so anyway, you could just see it, like they're getting these pieces. They got Liam Spence, and they kept the best of who Dave and Larry had committed, which I do think you got to give Dave and who was the second baseman, left-handed hitting second baseman?
Max Ferguson.
Yep.
Max Ferguson, of course, Jake Rucker, of course, you got the Lipsius brothers and Evan Russell. Like there's pieces that Blade Tidwell, so you got to give, because back then you were recruiting 8th graders. So Larry and Dave did have some of those kids committed, but they did such a great job of finding, especially it seemed like Texas JUCO pieces and bringing them together with some of the pieces that were there.
Alric Solari.
Alaric was like, they got these players. They're like, wow, these are difference-making SEC players. So it just was very clear to me by 2020, like, yep, this team's in it. Now, did you know they were going to end up, as you said, Roons, going on one of the great 4-year runs the league has seen? No, but you knew they were in the mix for sure.
Yeah. Hey, so let's. I'll put a cap on the hire with this. Like, I have this bizarre analogy in my brain where it's like Tony V, when he was hired, all any of us could think about was the recruiter, and it's like, to me, thinking that's all Tony is. It's like looking at a Rolls Royce and just thinking it has nice tires, right? Like this dude is a head coach savant. Like I'll put it in my own opinion. What I didn't realize about Tony was he had been in all these great programs where they won a ton and he paid attention. Like, and obviously his dad's a Hall of Fame high school coach. And so, but I was so his persona was so overwhelmingly screaming recruiter at you that you didn't realize that this dude really understands winning, like really, really understands it. And like you mentioned the staff, like, you know, I'm sure it was like this for you too, Ben, but like, you know, his first staff, it's like you start seeing names like Frank Anderson. You're like, dang, okay, that's an elite hire. Because we see a lot of head coaches fail because their first staff is kind of thrown together. Tony V's first staff was not thrown together. You know, Josh Elander, perfect. You know, Ross Kivett, I don't think was on the first staff, but that's like an incredible volunteer assistant. Sean McCann, sneaky, great behind the scenes hire, great baseball guy. And then, you know, like, I don't know, Quentin Eberhardt, and it might be Eberhardt. Is it Eberhardt? Is that how you say it?
Eber,
yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Just for Tony, as I understand the story, and Ben, you could confirm, Tony kind of planted that flag with the administration, like, we're hiring a baseball only strength coach. Like, that's the hill I'm going to die on. And, you know, in my mind, you hire Q as we know him, and then you hire Frank, and the attitude of your program where maybe the kids are used to getting their lunch money taken has changed in an instant. Do I have that right, Ben, that like Q was one of the flags that Tony planted early on?
Yes, and it is proven to be very fruitful because Q is one of the best strength coaches in the country, and really somebody who doesn't get enough credit for the success that Tennessee baseball has had. Obviously, from a strength standpoint and getting the guys in shape and developing physically, but Quentin Eberhardt is as critical to Tennessee's culture as Tony Vitello is because Q is the one that kind of whips them into shape. If somebody steps out of line, like Tony may have a conversation with them, but it's Q that they're spending time with and being punished by. And Q is he's a prankster, he's a jokester, so he strikes that nice balance of being a big brother, but also the adult in the room when he needs to be. And he's been tremendous. And that to me is also kind of what is so intriguing about Tony's initial staff at Tennessee is because, like both of you have detailed, he brings in Frank Anderson, which I'm sure that sent shockwaves across college baseball coaching circles. Like, why is Frank Anderson following Tony Vitello in his first head coaching job to Tennessee of all places? But especially now in hindsight, I think it's very telling of what Frank thought of Tony. And I remember talking to Frank on the field after they won the national championship in June. He said that he would not have signed up to come along with Tony if he did not envision Tony being able to do what he has done and being able to win even at a place like Tennessee and what it was at the time. But you had an established Frank Anderson, but then the other names that you mentioned, Roons, like Josh Elander was unproven. Quentin Eberhardt, to a certain extent, unproven. Ross Kivett, nobody knew who Ross Kivett was. It was kind of like Josh Elander and Sean McCann, and then a bunch of guys, including Tony, that had something to prove. And that really trickled down throughout the program. And obviously they recruited well. I think that helped them on the recruiting trail, the edge that they had to prove themselves. And very, very fascinating dynamic because Frank is the veteran in the room, but then you had a bunch of young guys getting kind of their first crack at this and just completely grinded their rear ends off until they were able to find success.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to fast forward.
Roons, it reminds me just a little bit of McDonald and Lamonis, Tony and Elander.
Yeah.
You know, it's just two dudes that are just dogged recruiters. And I mentioned Frank ahead of Josh just because I knew Josh as a player, but the coaching pedigree wasn't there. But as you said, Roons, Tony immediately had that staff, which tells you he had already had that thing all the way planned out. So
yeah,
go ahead, Roons. Sorry.
So no, you're good. Like Frank Anderson is one of my favorite people in college baseball. And I like when I was still coaching, like every experience with Frank Anderson was absolutely miserable. I mean that in the best way possible. Like there's no coach I respect more, but like I remember recruiting against him for JP Howell back in the day, and it was awful. Like it was on, right? Like, cause we all knew, like, if you get this kid, your program just changed, and there's a good chance he's coming to school. And then, you know, and then just coaching against Frank, like Frank is the type of opponent coach where you tell your wife, hey, this is going to be a bad day at the office. We may win, but it's going to be a bad day. Like, I'm going to come back here with blood all over myself. Like, this is going to be unpleasant. I can't imagine what the umpires feel like when they, like, Frank is just, like, I know everybody at this level is an incredible competitor. Frank feels like the person that would literally rip your eyes out of your skull, but he would help you up after the game. Like, he would lift you back. I mean, just an incredible competitor. And of course his teams reflect that, like, so again, like, you start thinking about Tennessee one way, and then Tony assembles a staff and you're like, okay, this is probably going to look a little bit different. And so you guys talked about 18, 19, and 20. 18 is kind of like whatevs, like they don't make the SEC tournament, but it looks competent, looks, whatever. And then 2019, they're in a regional. What I thought was really interesting is they lost the first game in that regional, I think, to Liberty, which is not uncommon. You make a regional, it's so unique and spooky. And then they end up in the regional final. Like, they right themselves immediately. And then 2020 was, I think we were all confused about Tennessee in 2020. Like, we were starting to get on the bandwagon. And then they sweep that Round Rock Classic, and then they lose a home series to Wright State, and you're just like, it's confusing, right? Like, because was Wright State just really, was that one of their really good teams, or blah blah blah? You couldn't figure it out, and then it's the pandemic. 2021 happens, and I mentioned to you guys that that team got to Omaha. They won a home regional. They got to play a very young LSU team in the Super Regional as Pulmonaries last year. LSU was arguably the last team in the field. Tennessee just felt like much better than LSU in that Super Regional. But again, I want to say this again. Tennessee did not sneak into hosting. They were the number 3 national seed that year. My lasting memory from that is Wright State opening night of the regional. The place is electric. Ben, I'm sure you were there. And they are losing 8-5 in the ninth.
That's 22.
No, that's 21, isn't it?
No, 22 was the Wright State with Gilbert.
Drew Gilbert was not 2021. Okay. So who did they beat? I can pull it up real quick. Who did they beat in the 21 regional?
Ben?
I thought Wright State was 2021.
No, 20. The crazy year was 22, because that was when Gilbert threw it to the roof.
He hit the ball literally off the planet.
Yes.
I'm going to look it up while we're talking.
Look it up.
So Ben, let's do this before we get to that postseason.
Were you all on assignment?
Give us a memory from 2021, a player or a memory.
Ooh, Evan Russell.
Okay.
Against Mr. Leiter there in Vanderbilt. That was kind of I think that was the moment that particular team kind of said, hey, we're here, and we mean business. And then a couple of weeks later, if I remember correctly, Arkansas came to town, and Arkansas won the series, but it was a back and forth series. Arkansas took game 1. Tennessee came back and took game 2. I believe Max Ferguson hit a walk-off home run. And then Arkansas got the best of Tennessee on that Sunday. But that was when you knew that, okay, this team is a bit different. And you knew the program had already turned the page, because y'all talked about it. That 2020 team, you ask anybody around the program, and they'll tell you we were going to Omaha that year, because you had Crochet and Solari, but you also had Zach Daniels out in the outfield. He was on the verge of a breakout season. But that 21 team, Evan Russell kind of putting his foot down and having the 3 home run game against Vanderbilt, hit 2 off a Leiter. That was kind of the hey, we're here. Not only I thought they sent a message to Vanderbilt that weekend and that day, because obviously what Tim Corbin has built in the backyard, that's a huge rivalry game, and Tennessee kind of little brother in the series. That was when Tennessee bucked up and said, no, this isn't the same old Tennessee baseball that you all have known for the last decade or so. And not only did it send a message to Vanderbilt, but it also sent a message to, I think, college baseball that this Tony Vitello guy, he does indeed have Tennessee baseball turned around. And just the attitude of the team that I know was a hot topic amongst college baseball fans that year, but that's what they needed. And Tony's talked about this a bunch on the record.
Go ahead. 21 was just simmering. 22 was
wasn't what it, but that they had an edge to them.
They did.
They weren't at their peak, but it was getting there.
Yeah, it was getting just simmering.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fair.
But to your
Very
point,
true.
Ben, not to cut you off, but think about so by the way, Berkey, 21 was Wright State because 22 was Campbell, Georgia Tech, Alabama
right.
State. So
Wow.
but now think of it.
So
Now here's why
21
this
was
is confusing
okay.
because it makes Ben's point a little bit. 21 was
Thank you for looking that up. I'm
yeah.
sorry about that.
No, I love that history. So remember, 2021 was not Drew Gilbert's team. 21
Right.
was Rucker. It was
Right.
Spence. It
Russell.
was like I think about Chad Dallas. I think about Sean Hunley had that magical year.
Sean Hunley. Yep.
No, Gilbert had that moment, but I think was Ferguson on that team. I feel like he had one of the
Ferguson
big
was the second baseman. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short, the 20
and Beck was coming on. Yeah. I mean, it was Gilbert hit fourth on that team, but I want to say he hit like 275. He was like a good player. He was a clutch player, but he wasn't a great player yet. I guess you're right, Roons, because that was the first time they hosted. And it was like, oh my gosh, they hosted and they gave them Wright State as a 4 seed. So
that's right.
I guess
not a good draw.
I remember
Tyler Black, by the way, is in the big leagues with the Brewers,
Tyler,
and he went nuts that weekend.
Yeah, I for some reason thought that was the 22 team, but I called those games that Ben's talking about. Of course, that was the year after the pandemic, so we were doing all the games until the very end, live from home. And so I called all those games literally in the same room I'm talking to you in right now. But the other thing that I think happened in 21, because it was still makeshift crowds, and remember we were like growing in capacity as the year unfolded, is the legends of Lindsey Nelson showed up. And these crazy lunatic fans were right above the dugout, which was a little bit the throwback back to my era in the 90s when those people used to be absolutely ruthless. And you had these students that really attached themselves to that team. The other thing to remember was that was coming off the heels of the worst stretch of Tennessee football maybe ever.
Mm.
And you had the pandemic, and so basketball was very dead. And I can't remember what happened in that 20-year bin, but I feel like that was the year after Grant and Admiral left.
Yes,
so
basketball had kind of dipped there for a minute.
Basketball had taken just a little dip, and the fans couldn't come. And then all of a sudden, in 21, this baseball team shows up. They win 50 games. They win the East. You can get back outside. You can gather as a fan base. And I really felt like it was a perfect storm of Antony and all his charisma, and he's jumping into the stands, and his team is starting to stick their chest out a little bit. And I honestly think, Roons, the fan base was looking for something to fall in love with, and the baseball program gave it to them. And they closed down the street for the regional because they couldn't get everybody in. And Tony, I think in an article this week, talked about how that was a precursor for what they're now doing with the new stadium. And I think that was and then Danny White got hired right then.
Oh, wow.
And so like that, the new athletic director. So I remember talking to Danny in Omaha in 21. And so there was just a lot of pieces that came together right in that 21 season really is the catalyst for what we know Tennessee baseball to be today.
Yep. And by the way, I did this last night. That Wheels, the guy Wheels on YouTube that has these clips of like I watched the Wright State game again. It's like it's a compliment to Wright State and to Tennessee baseball. Like it is one of the all-time great college baseball games, and the finish is just gives you chills. If you're not a Wright State fan, clearly, then they're not gonna like the last 60 seconds of that video. But and then even they go to Omaha, and this starts the stretch, by the way, where Tennessee's last 3 Omahas, they face Andrew Abbott, big leaguer, Paul Skeens, and Jamie Arnold as their opening night assignment, but which is hard to believe that a national title was born of that menu. But so Ben, and again, who could ever forget Ross Kivett, one of my personal favorites, throwing his clipboard onto the field at what was then TD Ameritrade Park. It was just great. But it was, like to your guys' point, it's like, okay, now you have our full attention. And then 2022 happens. And I would say the Tennessee 2022 team might be the best thing to happen to college baseball ever. Like, I know that's a big statement. It's hyperbole, but like that was like the Kardashians. Like there was not if you like sports, you were following Tennessee baseball in 2022. So Ben, you got to live this. I felt like we all lived it, but you really lived it. What can you give us a memory or a moment or a summary of 2022 for you?
It was a traveling circus is what it was. I mean, it was something every single game, or at least in baseball terms, every single series, every single weekend. I remember they went to Ole Miss, and Ole Miss was number 1 at the time when Tennessee went to Oxford early in SEC play, and Tennessee ran them out of their own stadium. And I went to Oxford that weekend, and by the time Sunday rolled around, it was a very late arriving crowd and not many butts in the seat because of the way Tennessee had beaten them in that game 1 and game 2, and then Redmond Walsh that game 3
Even
actually
call the cops. It was bad. It was not good.
Yes, there were police officers everywhere around the stadium, and Redmond Walsh comes in and saves the game in game 3, and then if I remember correctly, they went to Vanderbilt that very next weekend. I think it was at Ole Miss and at Vanderbilt back to back, or something along those lines. And kind of like in 2021, Tennessee had those moments against Vandy and Arkansas to send a statement. Those early conference series in 2022 sent a statement that Tennessee was the real deal. And that team was just littered with talent, both on the mound, both at the plate. They had the personalities, they had the egos, in more good ways than bad, but sometimes the bad flared up more than it should have. But then they go to Vanderbilt, and you have the whole issue with Corbin wanting to check the bats and Mike Honcho. I mean, it was something like that every single weekend. There was one weekend where Luke Lipsius touches the plate with his finger when he's coming around the slide, and it was just absolute chaos every single weekend. I guess I don't know. This may be a bad comparison because those what was it? The 86 Mets are known for doing really bad things, and I don't mean to insinuate that Tennessee was doing bad things, illegal things along those lines. But it was just a traveling circus in the most positive way. I can say.
Lightning rod. No, your point's well taken. They were polarizing, no question.
Yeah, they were. That's exactly what they were. And you talked to a lot of those players that were on that team, and even Tony, and I think he said it at Omaha during one of his press conferences. Like, you can think what you want about them, that they helped to grow the sport that year. That they
100%.
absolutely did. To your point that you made a moment ago, and it came with some negatives at times, but I feel like it was mostly positive. It firmly put Tennessee baseball on the map, and ultimately they fell short, and they should have won the national championship that year. They did not, of course, but they firmly planted Tennessee baseball on the map, and I just remember it was something every other weekend. And as a writer and having to have content up, it was like you constantly had to be preparing. That was the year that Tony Vitello does the chest bump over at third base against Alabama.
Right.
And Frank and like Frank Anderson's gotten ejected because he's mad that Chase Dolander just took a line drive off the elbow because he thinks that the third base coach is tipping pitches. And like Tony goes out there, but Tony's not even upset about – he's obviously upset about Chase getting hit, but he's more upset because at third base was Jeffrey Macias, who was on the crew that threw out Ross Kivett in Omaha the year before. So there was like a beef that needed to be squashed. It was just something every weekend, and it was super entertaining on top of obviously the baseball just being elite. They were elite at baseball that year, and they were very, very entertaining in the process.
Yeah, I mean, 57-9, 25-5 in the SEC, which is literally impossible to do. 8 players had double-digit home runs on that team. 8 out of 9, in theory, starters. You had the rotation of Dolander, Beam, and Burns, and Burns and Beam are true freshmen. And I remember Beam was through 7 starts and given up like 13 hits or some ridiculousness. I didn't realize Xander Seacrest had 11 starts on that team. I couldn't even have told you he was on that roster. Now I'm sure those were midweek starts, but
it started every Tuesday.
Yeah, Berkey, what give me your thoughts on 2022.
Yeah, I think the Ole Miss series was the holy cow. This KP was down there, and he texted us. That's the best college team I've ever seen. And as Roons knows, there's 2 things about KP. He's not prone to hyperbole, and he's really not prone to giving Tennessee compliments on the thread that I'm on.
Also not prone to being active on that thread. Like for him to even put something
That's right. So when KP, like, he's like in the 7th game of like game 2 of that series, he's like, I think I'm watching the best college team I've ever seen. Well, then the next weekend, I'm at the Vanderbilt series. Dave Neal and I had that series. And I got to ask the question about the bat. And that's where Tony did my concho. And I just, with Tony, you don't know how much of it's like premeditated or it's just his knack for doing things that are outside the box or however you want to phrase it. But like, I mean, by the next week, they're selling like thousands of Mike Honcho jerseys. I mean,
I need one.
It's just incredible.
And if you go to a Tennessee football game, Berkey, you go to the Tennessee Florida game this weekend, you will see double-digit people wearing Mike Honcho jerseys.
How great is that?
And we there's a name that hasn't been mentioned. Ben Joyce was on that team.
That's right.
Okay, and so social media and especially the pitching ninja had really become popular. The world was following college baseball at a heightened level because there was a period of time there post-COVID where college baseball had – because remember the baseball had like a holdout there for a period. MLB had a holdout, and college baseball had everybody's audience. And I think it was that same year, and people were like, holy crap, what is up with this Tennessee team? So you got a coach that threw a bat at the other team's dugout. That happened. Tony threw the bat at the Auburn dugout. He also chest bumped the other coach. You got Drew Gilbert, who's hitting the light tower with bat flips, right? You got the head coach is saying that his best player is a 35-year-old walk-on or something like that. And they're killing people. They're like run-rolling SEC baseball games. Mike Bianco's team won the national championship that year. They were the champs. And in Omaha, he would still be talking about Tennessee. He would just like bring them up, They had Drew Beam, Chase Burns, and Chase Dolander, and Blade Tidwell. So they had 3 first-rounders and a second-rounder was their starting rotation. And the fastest throwing pitcher on earth. College baseball team. Christian Moore and Blake Burke were their platooning DHs, and they both got 100 at-bats, and they both hit 10 home runs or more in 100 at-bats, who turned out to be the 2 greatest home run hitters in the history of the school. Like, it's you just can't, like, Joel Ortega, like, what? He's turns into like this clutch home run hitting, but Trey Lincecum,
yeah.
It's like, it just, at one point, Luke Lipsius had the home run record for the school.
Evan Russell just moved the catcher that year.
That's right.
To catch, and was catching a bunch of big leaguers. So I think that team, and Roons, I think the numbers still aren't there yet, right? Because Moore's not there and Beam's not there and Burns and Dolander aren't there. But like, I can't remember that Florida team that ended up with 12 or 13 big leaguers. I can't remember. You know what I'm talking about, Roons.
Yep.
But that Tennessee team, I mean, when it's all said and done, it will have to be on the shortest list of teams with the most big leaguers. I mean, and it wasn't just guys that made it to the major leagues. Like, Roons, you said it, and I won't say that because I'd get burned if I said what you said, but I just don't think there's ever been that much star power in one college dugout. That starts from the head coach all the way through.
Yeah,
to the freshman DHs.
You couldn't take your eyes off them. They were so good for the sport in a lot of ways. Like they were no one could stop talking about them. But to your point, Ben, like this was one of the great all-time college baseball teams. Their team ERA was 2.5. They slugged over 600. They stole 85 bases. They fielded 980. Like there was no way you could beat them. And then they had the swagger and then the Notre Dame Super Regional was like watching the movie Hoosiers made right in front of your face, right? Like it was so improbable, but credit to that Notre Dame team. And just a season none of us will ever forget. Let's do 20. Go ahead, Bert.
Real quick. The construction of the team had its flaw in that. Not the construction of the team, the composition of the team, excuse me, in that so much of their innings were on very young arms that were starting to run out of gas just a little bit late. And then as weird as it sounds, with the hardest thrower on the earth in their bullpen, their back end guys were actually contact pitchers in Redmond Walsh and Kirby Cannell. And so you always knew if it was close in a game 3 of a super, like the ball was probably going to be put in play. And in that ballpark, any ball put in play has a chance to do damage. And it ended up being the opposite field 3-run homer from a dude who I
David
think had
Lamana.
like a couple
Catcher.
home runs all year. Yeah, like
defense first catcher.
And that was off Chase Burns.
It's crazy. Yeah, it was just that could be its own podcast. That 2022 season it was just incredible. Hey, so Ben, we're gonna go to 2023. They come in the preseason. They must have been the number 1. They're a 2 seed in that Clemson regional. It's just like from the jump, they lose opening weekend to Arizona. I was at that game. It was weird. Like it was Arizona. Tennessee just looked not settled. And Tony was very open and honest about that team. Like, hey, we lost a lot of leadership from that team before. The 2022 team was one of those teams where coaches don't have to go to practice, right? Like that team is very self-sufficient. 2023 was not that way. And then they lose to Grand Canyon opening weekend. So they lose opening weekend out in Arizona. But obviously what I can't, what I always remember about that team is the 14-inning game at Clemson in that regional. And we said that, not that we were some geniuses, but during the year, as Tennessee was scuffling, we were saying, boy, some host has got a nightmare coming that they're not aware of yet. And that's named Tennessee. So Ben, give us 2023 from your perspective. What stands out from that year?
That they were 2 totally different teams. I mean, you mentioned opening weekend and Clemson weekend, 2 totally different teams. That team that you saw in Arizona, they did not have the leadership that you had become accustomed to seeing with Tony Vitello. And part of that was obviously the change that it had gone through, and it had lost so many guys. But they also that team didn't gel together very well either, and they struggled for the first half of the season, maybe a little bit more than just a half of a season, because they lacked leadership and they just never gelled all that well. And it took that embarrassing weekend at Arkansas for them to have a wake up call, and they come back to Knoxville, and I believe Vanderbilt was coming to town that weekend, and then they got Vanderbilt, swept Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt was a top 5 team in the country. They had the crazy walk off on Friday night, or game 1, whether that's Thursday or Friday. And Dylan Dreiling and Kavaris Tears have solo home runs kind of out of nowhere, heroic home runs, and Griffin Merritt eventually has the walk-off home run. It took too long for that team to come together, and it eventually came together, and that's all that matters at the end of the day. But that team, the first half of the season, it struggled because it was not a team. It was a lot of individuals playing college baseball together. You had brought in Maui Ahuna. You had some freshmen on the team from the year prior that had big-time freshman seasons, and I think they maybe allowed their ego to get the best of them in year 2 and putting themselves before the team. But that Arkansas weekend was a bit of a wake-up call when you had Maui Ahuna and Christian Moore up the middle miscommunicate on a ground ball on a double play, and you had some balls drop in the outfield, and Tony made some lineup changes. One of them was putting Hunter Ensley in center field and Christian Scott in right field, and he chose to roll with the defense and the leadership and the guys that he trusted, and it turned the season around. So that's what sticks out to me about that team. It had all the talent in the world. I think it was actually number 2 in the preseason behind LSU, because LSU had just gotten Tommy White and Paul Skeens and that whole transfer class, if I'm not mistaken. But still high expectations on that 23 team coming off of the 22. And to your point about Tony, I mean, all offseason long and all preseason long, Tony was like, I don't know that we're the number 2 team in the country. Let's do something first before we're ranked number 2 in the country. And I think that he knew that team did not gel the way that it needed to in the fall and in the preseason, and it took a bit of a wake-up call. But once they had that wake-up call, the talent finally took over, and you had some guys finally accept their role and begin to thrive in their role. And that's what allowed them to take off and have a very memorable postseason. Everybody talks about Clemson, but that Southern Miss series, like if your culture
Lost game
is not,
one. Yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
lost game one, weather delays, sitting under the bleachers, and the weather was awful all weekend long in Hattiesburg. Tennessee didn't want to be in Hattiesburg in the first place. They felt like they should have been the ones hosting back in Knoxville. But for them to kind of grit through both of those weekends, it to me spoke to just how much the culture and leadership did come into place, because you don't make it out of those weekends back to back if your culture and leadership is not in place.
Yeah. I remember in the Clemson game, Chase Burns loads the bases in extra innings and gets out of it. It was just like, yeah, it was, if you're Clemson, you got to be thinking like, how in the heck did we draw these dudes as a 2-seed? I mean, are you kidding me? They got a reliever throwing 100. It's like it was a future top 10 pick. So let's talk about let's save the rest of the time for 2024. So the off season is interesting, right? Because you have this tumultuous 2023 season that does end in Omaha. Now, of course, you have to face Paul Skeens in Omaha, and that's bad policy, right? That's not going to go well. But obviously Tennessee is very relevant at this point. But Chase Burns transferred out, and some good players transferred in. What Ben? I'll start with you, and then come to you, Berkey. What, like, going into the 24 season, what felt like the big storyline to you?
The pitching staff and who was going to step up, and did they have enough arms? Because you looked at the lineup, and I sat at every fall scrimmage that I could that fall leading into that season, and I was at several scrimmages going into the season in the preseason, and the lineup just tormented the pitching staff. Like, you knew that it was a team that was going to hit. Now, I don't know that I thought that they were going to hit as much as they ended up hitting. I didn't think that they would be that deep and that good offensively, but I knew they were going to hit. I didn't know if they had the arms to have the season that it ended up having. And there for a while, it didn't look like they were going to have the arms that were going to get them over the hump and allow them to win a national championship. And separate conversation, but Xander Seacrest takes a huge step forward and becomes a postseason hero that Tennessee fans will remember forever. But opening weekend, Xander struggled a bit. And Xander, as an older guy, he had spent most of his career as the midweek guy, and he's that great story that every program loves to have of didn't get upset that he wasn't pitching the innings or getting the starts that he felt like he should, and then he stuck it out and he continued to develop, and he earned that opportunity to start opening weekend, and it didn't really go his way, and Tennessee just had no idea what to do with that third spot. They continued to roll with Xander, but it was still a question mark, and that to me was the overall question mark with the team early on, is did they have enough pitching to get over the hump and go win a championship? And eventually they got there, but it took them some time, and it's still remarkable to me that they were able to win the national championship, and the ERA and the pitching statistics ended up being what they were after losing A.J. Russell, because they felt like A.J. Russell had a chance last year to be as good as anybody who has taken the mound for them. And we've already talked about Garrett Crochet and Blake Tidwell and some of those other big time names. They felt like A.J. Russell was going to have that type of season. I mean, Drew Beam is a junior, by far QB1, the leader of the pitching staff, and A.J. Russell's the one that gets the baseball in game one. And Drew didn't do anything wrong. It was more about what they felt like they had in A.J. So just wondering, would SEMO take a step forward? Would Blake Burke take a step forward? Is the leadership in place? Because it wasn't in place to begin the season the year prior, as I just got done talking about. But this team, they talked about it throughout the year. It was just different from the time they showed up in August when school started and throughout fall ball. It just felt different than the year prior. Guys were hanging out all the time. They connected well. They enjoyed being around each other. It didn't feel like they had to be around one another. They enjoyed being around one another, and that obviously they had a bunch of skill in the field. But I feel like the chemistry within the locker room that was genuine and didn't have to be forced like it had to midway through the year prior, that allowed them to go as far just as much as their skill on the field did.
Yep. So, Berkey, I want to have you hone in on Christian Moore and Blake Burke. I was wrong about those two guys. Like, at the end of 23, I thought Christian Moore was the best player on the field in the Clemson Regional. Like he had my attention, but he felt like one of those guys who was like prone to streaks in both directions. Like he's hyper aggressive and he's just going to go off for a while and then he's going to disappear for a while and go off. Like we've always seen players like that. And I was really concerned about Blake Burke after 23. Like I felt like he had been exposed. I thought he was a below average defender. And then, I think this is the part about Tennessee's program that doesn't get enough credit is players get better in that program. Like Trey Lipscomb doesn't play and then he's a star. He's a big leaguer. And like I think Blake Burke, and I can't think of a player recently that's made a bigger jump year over year. Now it's funny, if you look at 2023 numbers for Blake Burke, I thought he would have punched out 100 times. It wasn't anywhere near that. It was like 50. But I thought those two guys were absolute separators. Like, now Tennessee has the two best players on the field in 2024, as opposed to just one player of that ilk.
Yeah, well, first let me say, I think 23, if you thought Tennessee baseball was a fluke, 23 showed you it wasn't. Like if you thought it was all pomp and circumstance and it was all glitz and glamour and, the whole pop-off rule for 22 is why they didn't get to Omaha and blah, 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 blah. You're like, then they got off to an uneven start in 23 and you're like, yeah, see, I told you the whole thing was fake. And then you're like, oh, wait, they just came back from a 5-10 start in SEC play and they just went on the road and beat a rock solid Clemson team. And then they just went on the road and won in a place that is very, very hard. Like, and so in a coach that's retiring, like his team's playing for him, all this kind of stuff. So I just felt like 23 really, if 21 put them on the map, 23 showed they weren't going anywhere.
Right.
And then in 24, they have one of the greatest seasons of all time, highlighted by two of the greatest players of all time in the school's history. And I think Simo is just a star who's just a world-class, as I like to say, ball striker. He hits the baseball consistently as hard as anybody in the sport, and that was proven as soon as he got to pro ball. And he's also this presence that elevates his team because he's on your team. You're like, we have him. So we all feel better about ourselves because we get to put his name in the lineup and hit him first. So like he's like in and of itself, that's crazy. But then the guy who hits right behind him in the lineup, as the year unfolded, Tim Corbin called Blake Burke Will Clark. Like
remember that.
Tim Corbin said that. Chris Burke didn't say that. I'm quoting Tim Corbin. Tim Corbin called him Will Clark. And there were multiple coaches in the league that told me they just could not wait they couldn't wait to play Tennessee next year so that Blake Burke and Christian Moore weren't on the team. They were overplaying Christian Moore and Blake Burke. Like I think Blake's defense as the year went on became this incredibly difference-making element to the team that is really hard to quantify at first base. But, he had to play against Florida State where he got caught too far off the base. But if you think about the genesis of that is he's so wanting to make a play that he's 20 feet from first base. And he made multiple plays with his arm and with his glove that I think showed that he was playing a game like way above the college field. And he was having at-bats. Both of them were having at-bats way above the college norm. And by the middle point of the season, like you're right about Blake Burke. He might have only struck out, whatever you said, 50-something times as a sophomore, but he also had another 50 at-bats where he put the first pitch of the at-bat in play terribly.
Yeah.
Like he probably gave away more at-bats his sophomore year than he actually dug in and had a great at-bat in. And then all of a sudden his junior year, it's like world-class at-bat after world-class at-bat. And Roons, you said it multiple times. You don't think you've ever seen a player improve as much as Blake Burke improved, And so you asked me to speak on those two players, so I'll just land with those two players. But I do think, we can talk about the equipment and the modern game with the power and all that. But those two players, they can play Tennessee baseball for another 100 years. Till whenever Jesus comes back and they're done playing baseball, Blake Burke and Christian Moore are going to be on the short list of greatest players the school's ever seen, because they truly were legendary program-changing talents. They really were.
Yeah. Hey, let's wrap with this, boys. This has been great. We could go on and on, but let's wrap with this. So my question for you, Ben, is during the 24 season, when did Tennessee winning a national title enter your brain as that actually could happen? Because I'll tell you, for me, I was a real late comer to that party. Like them going to Omaha, I felt like was always on the table. But like what you said about the fall, Ben, that was a thing. Who are the dudes on this pitching staff? Who are the draft picks? And then AJ Russell's really good opening weekend, I believe. And then next thing you know, he's gone. And now you're like, holy heck, this is Drew Beam better become freshman year Drew Beam again, or what's going to happen? And then they lose their first weekend of SEC play. They lose that series to Alabama, and the SEC was a little wonky last year. It was hard to get your arms around it. I have an answer, but I'm going to save my answer. It may be the same as yours, but when did it become real for you, Ben? Hey, this could be something.
For me, it was that Kentucky weekend in Lexington. Just the grit and the determination, and they just refused to lose. And Christian Moore set the tone for that. Blake Burke helped set the tone for that. And if I remember correctly, Stamos, who opened in game one for them, I don't think he pitched all that well in that game one at Kentucky. And Causey came in and pitched fairly well, and they blew the game late. And Kentucky takes game one, and then Tennessee comes back and takes game two. And then game three was just a back and forth heavyweight title match, and Tennessee is able to come out on top because Christian Moore and Blake Burke were leading the way. So I had questions about the pitching staff and if they had enough pitching to win it all for a long time. But it was that Kentucky weekend, and although that weekend didn't necessarily answer my questions about the pitching staff, it was the grit and the determination that I thought would help them get over the hump. And okay, maybe they lack an arm or two here and there, but because of just the attitude and the edge and the fire that they coach and play with, I think that is going to propel them to that national championship. And obviously coming out of that weekend, I didn't leave Lexington driving back to Knoxville and be like, Tennessee's winning the national championship, but I certainly viewed them as a team that is more than capable of winning it. And something that I actually wanted to touch on really quickly, kind of in how Tennessee has gotten to this point under Tony Vitello, is everybody thinks of Tony as a recruiter, and opposing fans think of him as a hothead in the dugout and this and that. But Tony has evolved over the course of his tenure at Tennessee. And sure, what he does best is probably recruiting. And that's really what he actually does best. Is he's an elite people's person. People gravitate to Tony. Opposing fan bases may not, but players.
They would if he was their coach, Ben.
Yes, 1,000%. He could run for mayor in Knoxville right now, and he would win. But he has evolved, because one of the downfalls Berkey was talking about, the roster construction of that 22 team that lost to Notre Dame. The other reason that they lost that weekend was because they lost their composure, and Drew Gilbert was not available. Frank Anderson was not available. I thought their lack of composure hurt them as much as anything they did skill-wise that weekend. Those days were over this past season. Tony made a concerted effort, in my opinion. I think he knew he needed to tone down a little bit or harness it in a different way. And I thought he did a great job of harnessing his emotions and wearing his heart on his sleeve this past season better than he ever has before. And I thought you could really see that in that Kentucky series. Obviously, you had the fight with the guys on the field, but then Tony, throughout the year, not just this weekend, that particular weekend, but evolving and being more of that traditional manager as well. Tony pressed a lot of the right buttons throughout the course of the season, and I thought that was a weekend that highlighted that. You always knew that Tennessee was going to play with an edge and the fire, but to see the maturation of Tony Vitello himself and how he has evolved into just a great all-around CEO and not somebody who's just known as a recruiter and somebody that's passionate. That was kind of the weekend when I saw all those things. Even if I still had questions about the pitching staff, I thought it was a legit possibility that they could win a national championship.
Yeah, that's the right answer. Berkey, you're getting the final question of the night. And, you played there, right? And we're, as analysts, we have to be impartial. And you didn't play for Tony, obviously, but that's where you played. That's just like for me at Notre Dame. I didn't play for Sean Stifler, but it's still where I played. And I remember the scenes, like that parade in Knoxville. I have no connection to Tennessee baseball. That moved me, like seeing that, how the Tennessee fan base, how much they loved this coach and this team and that national title, how much it meant to this athletic department and fan base. For you as a guy that played there and, your teammates are friends for life, I'm sure. What did this mean to that group, to you could say the fan base, but even the baseball alumni group? What did this national title mean to you guys?
First, I knew they were going to win it all when they won the SEC tournament and didn't try to. So that's when I was sure of it. I think for the fan base, I'll go fan base and then player. I think for the fan base, being a part of the fan base, Tennessee has been on a pretty good stretch here the last 4 years and 4 years in all the major sports, including a lot of the women's sports, and nobody's won the whole thing. And I think seeing one of their teams win the whole thing, especially one that, like I said, kind of brought Tennessee out of the doldrums, I think in a lot of regards post-COVID, I think was very, very special for a lot of people. They also did it in an extremely heroic way. I mean, the Florida State game was one of the great college baseball games ever played. And then the Hunter Inslee slide in game 3 and it went game 3, and Hunter has this slide. Of course, Hunter had the incredible catch. Like, they just did it in a heroic way. So I think that the fan base, in a greater sense, connected to that team in a special way. I really do. Like, I really do. As an alumni, I don't know if this is true about every school, but I think, let's just take the Southeastern Conference. I think most players that played at a Southeastern Conference school really love their school, and really think their school can be great, or, went there because it was great, or they thought it was going to be great, And so I think to see your team hold the trophy, especially knowing they never have, I think I can speak for a lot of the alumni when I say that I think everybody was just really proud of what the players were able to do, because I think all of us players know how hard it is what they did is to win the regular season, to win the SEC tournament, to win the national championship, to do it after losing game 1 of the championship series, to come back against Florida State the way they did, the amount of clutch performances that were exhibited on that team, and just run into the wall and play hurt and all that stuff. I think it was a team that was really easy to root for, but then when they actually won the final game and held the trophy up, I think it was a team that connected all generations of former players. And man, I'm really proud I put on that jersey. That team made me really proud that I wore that jersey.
Yeah, that's really well said. Oh man, this has been great, you guys. I really appreciate this. I'll put a bow on it like this. I think about the SEC in baseball and some of these coaches, the way I grew up on Big East basketball, how some of the personalities of those coaches, they changed that sport for forever. And I think I know this is a big statement, but I think Tony Vitello's Tennessee baseball program changed college baseball forever. He and this program have helped us as a sport take a jump that, I don't know, that was just destined. Like, I think that it's been a special time in our sport, and for it to end in a national title this year felt so appropriate, and it was such a fun journey for sure. So I knew it was going to be a challenge to capture all of this because there's so much there, but I thought you guys nailed it. I really appreciate that. So well done, you guys. Hey, for the listeners, next week the Sunday Night Conversation is going to be on Evansville's run this year, ironically pushing Tennessee to Game 3 of a Super Regional. And we'll have Wes Carroll on as the guest. There's a lot there. Evansville's program that had a number 1 pick overall, Andy Bennis back in the day. And there's a rich history there, but there was a wild ride to get to this year. So anyway, these have been so fun. Ben and Berkey, well done, you guys. Really appreciate it. Everyone have a great week. And that's it from here. We'll catch you next time on the D1 Baseball Podcast.